Good to see everyone's looking caffeinated for the afternoon. So welcome back from lunch, and I'd like you to introduce you to the technology panel. As we talked about earlier, technology has been a game changer for our sector during COVID-19, but still presents challenges for organisations in terms of investment, development and sustainability. And meanwhile, the digital divide still means that when services go online, many vulnerable communities miss out. Although using technology can also open doors for others, it can actually be exacerbating disadvantage. Today, we're going to look at a range of perspectives and examine what we've learned in the past few years, what investing in technology has taught us, and the directions for the future. Our panellists are Elle Gibbs, who's an award-winning writer and disability advocate. Elle's coming in via Zoom. Can you hear us, Elle?
I can, Dee.
Yay! Hello. Marcus Harvey, who we heard from before, the Manager of Digital Transformation Hub InfoXchange. Matthew Keeley, the Director of Youth Law Australia, and Nadene Lee, CEO of Playgroup New South Wales. So if you guys could take your seats. And again, if we can keep remarks around the 4 to 5 minute mark, that'd be superb. Elle, we're going to start with you. Thank you for joining us from Wiradjuri country. You've been a significant voice in shouting out for people with health concerns and disability to be heard during COVID, pushing hard on accessibility and inclusion and holding government and institutions accountable for their impact of their decisions. Tell us what technology during this time has meant for you and take us through some of the nuances for the good, the bad and the tricky bits of technology for people with disabilities.
Thanks, Dee. Will do. But just before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming from unceded, stolen Wiradjuri country out here in central west New South Wales and pay my very deep respects to elders past and present. Thanks to NCOS for having me, and I am coming to you remotely thanks to COVID and technology. The technology changes that COVID has brought for disabled people have been both good and challenging, to be nice about it. For disabled people like me that have good internet access, a job and communication that's easy to understand, the increase in remote access has been amazing, to be honest. I'm severely immunocompromised, as more people understand that now, and getting COVID would be a disaster for me. So I've spent most of the last 2.5 years at home. Now, with most of the safety measures being removed, making decisions about what is safe and what isn't for me is getting much harder. So I appreciate still having some remote access to things. That's rapidly fading. I worked from home for a long time before COVID, and the tech was always pretty crap, which is the official term. I was often stuck on someone's phone in a corner of a meeting, struggling to hear what was going on and never feeling even remotely equal. So when COVID arrived and everyone in my kind of work went online, everything changed. It turned out making accessible work online wasn't actually that hard when non-disabled people needed it. But suddenly I was on a level playing field with everyone else. I've given evidence to the Royal Commission, to Senate inquiries. I've been to concerts, to comedy shows, to plays and book launches, none of which I would have got to do before this. But this wasn't the case for everyone. So for people who use captions, particularly people who are deaf and hard of hearing and people with auditory processing needs, the online world was very inaccessible, particularly in the early days. Captions and Auslan were used regularly, and different video systems often conflicted completely with screen reader technology and didn't really have keyboard shortcuts that people who are blind or have low vision use. For people with intellectual disability, they were very much excluded by this move online. Many people didn't have internet-ready devices or accessible ways of accessing information. This meant that NDIS support, such as health services, were really hard for much of our community to access. We had to fight the NDIS to actually come to the party in terms of providing devices for people, and that took about 6 months. Government COVID information remained inaccessible, with much of it only on websites and not in accessible formats such as Easy Read. But look, we used technology in lots of different ways to fight for what we needed. So we created in 2020 a Facebook information clearinghouse. And it feels a bit old-fashioned to talk about Facebook, but it's a very effective organising tool, and lots of people are on Facebook that aren't on other social media. So we use that to share information, to translate a lot of the public health orders, to talk about where to get help, and to kind of problem solve together, disabled people and people with chronic illness, to support each other. We did a lot of activism work as well from that group, and it was a very powerful way of working together. We did the same in 2021, where a group of us got together and used a bunch of online tools to fight for access to the vaccine. Again, we shouldn't have to do this, but we use technology very effectively to argue to politicians, both in New South Wales and federally, why disabled people were the priorities for the vaccine and what they needed to do right now to make sure that we could get access to it. So we've been using these kind of mechanisms throughout COVID to work together to hold decision makers to account and to share our stories with the Disability Royal Commission, which has held 3 lots of hearings and reports into what has happened to us during COVID. There are still huge inequalities in access and availability that need to be fixed, but we use COVID to organise, to agitate, to inform, to entertain, to comfort, to fight, to chat and to care. And I'm quite sure that this infrastructure that we've built during COVID will endure for the fights and the work to come to make the world more inclusive and accessible for all of us. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Elle. I think your point about Facebook is right. Everyone's always saying to me, there's all these other platforms, and it's like, you know what, if you look at the stats in terms of who is on Facebook, it is by far the broadest platform that we have. And because it was one of the first, people didn't tend to self-select as much. You've got friends, work mates, family, so it's less of a bubble. And particularly in COVID, it became the centre, like the community Facebook pages on there became sort of, the hubs. I mean, I love TikTok, but and Twitter is the worst campaigning tool on earth, as much as I love that as well. So Facebook is still the best online tool that we have, regardless of all the ethics associated with it, of which there are many. We're going to move on to Marcus now. Marcus, Elle paints a pretty complicated picture requiring a lot of nuance. What does it mean to work in a technology-enabled way? What are some of the benefits of an online environment, and what are some of the known and hidden costs? What do organisations need to think about in investing and building systems to have people-focused outcomes?
I'm going to say, first of all, that technology is not always the answer. I love tech. I think it can change people's lives. I think it can make a huge difference to everyone in the sector. But smashing a square peg into a round hole is not the solution. And, some of the stories that Elle tells about, it's not, captioning's great, now free, wasn't there a couple of years ago, but not great for people with an intellectual disability. That's absolutely true. Same with, we've been doing a lot of work with organisations in rural and remote areas, and the internet is just not up to scratch in those areas for many of the services what they need to move into a new world. While there are services out there like Elon Musk's Starlink, which are actually very cost effective compared to most of the NBN options out there, or more useful at least, there's some real challenges still, and being aware of that and not trying to smash that square peg into the round hole is really important. When I think about the benefits and also the costs, I'm going to start by saying the first thing you need is a desire. You need a desire to use technology well. You need an expectation that technology can help me work effectively, that technology can enable my organisation to capture the information and deliver good services. You need a deep want, because this one's hard sometimes, to go, tech can give me value for money. It's not just this black hole. And if you have that and you seek the right advisors or the right partners, because you usually can't do it all yourself, all of a sudden the benefits can start to accrue. So your staff can work from home as easily as they can in the office, and it's been really pleasing to see. We do a annual technology in the not-for-profit sector report looking at this year's, still being analysed, going to be out shortly, numbers subject to change. But those that had everything in, organisations that had everything in place to allow people to work from home jumped from about 50% to 80%. So we have come a long way across the country. And that really gives that flexibility to people that can't get into the office and who need to stay at home, whether it's for school pickup or for remote reasons, all those sorts of things. But the more that you can actually also use technology for service delivery, the more effectively, and there's a lot that still don't do that. I think 2/3 said, oh yeah, I can capture data that's useful about my clients and services. About 1/3 in last year's survey again said, I can understand my impact. So there's a long way we can go there. But if you can do that, all of a sudden you can start to understand your impact and to tweak your services in a way to maximise that impact. Having the right tech so that your staff understand the services that have been delivered in the past and can understand someone's story and history, it really makes a massive difference when you're providing services out in the field. And so for me, that's what gets me excited. There are costs though, right? And while you need to say, I want value for money out of my tech, you do need to pay what it takes, right, from a technology perspective, and funders need to support that in an appropriate manner. Back of house services are not free, and they shouldn't be considered as 5%'s fine, thank you very much. It's just completely unrealistic to operate. From my perspective, you don't want to spend nothing on technology because then you're back in paper and it's really hard to provide services out in the field. You're at risk of flood and fire risk, particularly the way things are changing here. But you also don't want to spend 100% on technology because then you're not actually doing anything useful. So it's getting the balance right that's important. And it's also about recognising that if you've been underspending on technology for a period of time, for many organisations we've worked with recently, mid-decades, then you're probably going to have to overspend for a little bit before you come back to that equilibrium. But I think the key thing for me is making sure you have a desire to get value out of tech is what's really important. And then talk to people that have done it before, learn from them, don't reinvent the wheel, and get those partnerships working. And it can really change things. Thanks, Dee.
Thank you. I think it's probably also worth saying that also with that tech you have a responsibility to protect people's privacy, particularly when we're talking health and we're talking conditions that people don't want necessarily to be public, and as we've seen with Optus, unless you put that really good back end in there.
And that's a really good point. I was going to cover that later on, but I'll mention it now because one of the biggest challenges in our sector, we have some of the most confidential data that we really need to protect very strongly. And the great thing about the cloud is that it does allow you to work anywhere. The real problem about the cloud is it allows others to try and access that sensitive information from anywhere. And we have seen organisations move a little bit too quickly without thinking about how do I effectively protect the information from threats such as what happened to Optus, and there's plenty of non-profits that have been through similar stories. So making sure you're going through that journey with an appropriate protection mindset, because there's real trust that people give us when we provide them with services that they need. And that trust needs to be replayed by us keeping that information safe and secure. It is actually Cyber Security Month in October. It's the funnest month of all. I don't know, ends with Halloween, so let's leave it alone. But last year, only 1 in 2, 50% of organisations had started to get those real basic critical protections like two-factor authentication in place on their key systems. And for me, There are some things that are really easy to do, but not, and really critical to make sure that you treat the information that your clients provide you with the trust that it deserves, and you make sure that you can, continue to provide those critical services.
A couple of years ago, the Liberal government they accused the Labor government of doing a scare campaign about the privatisation of Medicare. And so we're not privatising Medicare, just the back end. You know what's in the back end? All your information. Right, Matt, Youth Law Australia is a pretty sharp technology-enabled legal service focusing on young people, but also doing some highly sensitive work, such as the chat service for young people seeking advice and information about child sexual abuse. How do you walk the line of having the right tech system while making human interaction a priority?
Thanks, Dee. I think essential to good human interaction, of course, is authenticity. And for us, we're a national legal practice for young people. Our motto internally is every young person, every problem, everywhere. And technology has been a good fit for us. The internet knows no borders, and so we're neither local nor state-specific, we're national, and hence the internet's been very helpful in allowing children to access our services. But that's really because it's so consistent with who we are. Our vision for rights for all young people being fully realised, our purpose to deliver access to justice and rights enforcement for young people. So I think authenticity is the starting point. The congruency of your tech with your mission, objects and values. Turning though to another matter that's essentially human, and that's the question of trust. And we alluded to it a moment ago when it came to data security. My own sense, and I'm not an expert by any sense, but having listened to experts like Marcus and others, and it is easy to get carried away with your technology projects, and I'd suggest not to, and to start with small projects if it's a relatively new field for you. If a project fails and it's a relatively minor project, then no harm, no foul, but you do take away some learning, so that's not a bad thing. But I believe that to be essentially human is to work in that notion of trust, and that means putting risk first and foremost. And that's something everyone's familiar with, the risk management frameworks you already have in your organisations, and this is nothing new. Some of the concepts will become new, but the means by which you uncover those concepts will be the same risk management framework you already apply. When we look at those risks, some of them we've already alluded to, the risks of exclusion, the risk of people perhaps being harmed, and the risk that people will find your service unusable and unfriendly. They're all some of the risks you'll identify when you start a tech project by putting notions of risk first, and of course you'll then need to mitigate those risks by asking, well, what can we do to be maximally inclusive? What can we do to make this as helpful to people as possible and reduce barriers and difficulty? And in that journey you'll discover that there's quite a few frameworks and tools that are quite elementary to read and understand, and which can put you on the path to learning about how to develop your tech projects in a way that is entirely congruent with the philosophies of our sector. Some of these frameworks are the Safety by Design framework from the E-Safety Commission, which I can commend to you. Notions of trauma-informed practice and vicarious trauma awareness, of course. Child safe principles, the National Child Safe Principles, for example. All of these frameworks, and of course frameworks around data security and breach responses, are well documented, and if they're approached at the front end of a project, perhaps even before you've procured something as you're identifying your needs, then you eliminate a lot of that risk and maximise the chances of project success. And the frameworks themselves, of course, like the National Child Safe Principles, are things that we should be looking at in any event, but looking at them from the perspective of our technology enablement might not be something we've done up until then. So if risk is first, then we can come to benefit second. And for an organisation like ours, the benefits of the interaction with the community of children and young people has been about access and reach, targeting, and the ability for someone to find us online, and then if our information isn't all that they need to help them, to then seek help either through a technological means or by contacting one of us human lawyers. There's always a human behind the tech, so that's also an essential aspect of how to keep the human within the interactions. But all of that ultimately, in terms of the design, I guess there's a couple of strategies that we have used, and I think consistent with what's been said so far. It's about continuous improvement and learning as we go. But we've engaged in a number of co-design practices. So our website was initially designed through communicating with groups of young people, bringing them together within forums and having what's called a card sorting exercise, which essentially was just them telling us, using bits of paper on a table, how we should create the website to better reflect their understanding of the concepts we're dealing with. We also use young people's natural language, so it's helpful that I have a cohort of young lawyers who work with us, and in our real-time services, which is the phone system, and that's the soft phone system that Marcus was alluding to, allowing my staff to work in 4 jurisdictions now. So whether it's phone or we have a live web chat service, the fact that young people, young lawyers, and most of them are under 25, are talking to other young people under 25 and using the same lingo and the same emojis, while all the time being entirely accurate with their legal advice, is something quite exciting, and something that the young people coming to us say that they really value. They give them thumbs up on the feedback. But of course then there's your data and feedback. So part of the tech is trying to make sure, subject to that risk management approach and the security of any data, that A, you're correcting the right data, B, it's not unnecessary, of course, and using that data and feedback. So we have online surveys, and I think it's probably still SurveyMonkey, most people are familiar with it, to generate, I guess, again, the voice of young people in our service, and to help us then to redesign. And we're in that process now with considering the redesign of our chat service. So Dee, those are some of the ways, I think, that we try to keep the human in the human interaction at YLA. I think
it's one of those areas when, you know, you hear young people online, you get the Daily Telegraph going, oh, they're all being groomed by pedophiles. And there's a bit of that, true, but online has actually allowed young people to report instances that never before would they have felt safe to do that, because the people they were reporting to, we know, you know, often it's usually a family member or someone they know, and also kids having conversations with adults is really hard anyway. So that online space has actually, you know, we hear a lot more about abuse, but it was happening before, but it's only through these things like what you do that we're actually able to do something about it. So I think it's one of the real advantages. We talk about the internet too much like it's a bad thing, and yet there's been so many positive sides to it as well.
I think we exist exactly in that sort of intersection of those two things. So young people really value a couple of things about our service, and it's unique because we're a legal practice. We have what's called legal professional privilege, which is an absolute form of confidentiality that doesn't exist elsewhere in other practice areas for reasons of mandatory reporting and information sharing frameworks and the like. So it is unique to lawyers, but allows us to be 100% confidential through the chat service, even on the phone. You know, if people want to remain anonymous, we will strive to give, within our professional duties and responsibilities, the best legal information and advice possible for someone who wants to be anonymous. So the help-seeking online aspect is absolutely phenomenal. But over the years, somewhere between 10 to 20% of our work is the cyber nasties. And it is true, there are international gangs that are targeting our children, and they're blackmailing them with intimate images. Cyberbullying in and around schools and friendship networks is incredible. There's online defamation. You know, we have clients who are well, they're just the most extraordinary. The variety of matters is so concerning, and I think that's one of the great values of our service is that alongside Say Only, I would say the E-Safety Commissioner and her office itself, we're maybe the only national space that children and young people go to speak to a human about this thing, which could be incredibly shameful. And often we're the trusted adult that they're speaking to and for the first time.
Yeah, right. Fantastic. Now, Nadene, Playgroup New South Wales. You don't sort of think of Playgroup in this space, but of course COVID, fast forwarded all that. You've had a major growth trajectory, reaching more than 50,000 families in New South Wales, delivering both digitally enabled services and support for communities, as well as growing face-to-face services. Playgroup New South Wales is successful in obtaining resources from SSTF to address your technology systems, and you married that up with a very strategic approach to your organisation's future. Tell us about your approach, what you are building and why.
First, before I launch into that, thank you. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and those online as well, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. The second acknowledgement that I'd like to do is to two special people in the room, one being Karen van Woudenberg and the other Karen Bevan, who were in the Playgroup organisation before my time, and I took over from Karen, so big shoes to fill, and then Karen we worked with for a couple of years. We're in the process at the moment. A lot of my day-to-day and long-term view is around how we can walk alongside Aboriginal communities, elders and families. And so Karen was instrumental in our organisation in establishing some of our programs. But where I say we've come a long way, but we're also understanding that we have a role to play alongside, not necessarily in front. So we're involving our strategy and our plans around that as well in an authentic way as we deliver our Innovate wrap. So the third acknowledgement, before I get to answering the questions, is around the impact of the pandemic on everyone worldwide. So whilst we had similar ways that it impacted us, some parents were teaching children from home and working from home, for example, and other examples of how things were similar. It was still very different for everyone. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor or suffering some kind of challenges or where you lived. It did impact everybody. I know for myself, I remember I was on the phone to my father one day and I said, "Dad, I'm seriously not built to be a full-time CEO trying to help an organisation stay afloat, be a full-time teacher to two small boys. We'd only just moved house and I was living in, so for me it was challenging despite the fact that I might have some some privilege in some areas that others didn't. So leading into what Department of Communities and Justice provided through the different tranches of the Social Sector Transformation Fund, that aligns with firstly, if I say the why of what we're doing is probably going to, I'll develop your thinking and understanding around what our organisation does, but ultimately we're aiming to double our impact in the next 5 years. And what that means for us is to double the reach in our programs and services that create equal opportunity and in development, wellbeing and health for children right through to older Australians. So interestingly with our organisation, did a bit of analysis the other day, only 30-odd% of our income at the moment annually is related to playgroup delivery. 40% relates to backbone wraparound services for children, families and communities. And then 20% is peer support for parents of children with disability and developmental delays. And then we have a range of other programs and services that we provide. So coming back to the Social Sector Transformation Fund and what we're aiming to do as an organisation, we're aiming to be in the right place at the right time with the right ideas to solve both our beneficiaries' challenges but also our funders and our partners. And Karen, both Karens were on that journey and can see how we've evolved over time. it has been a journey, and that's one thing that I'd like to acknowledge. So thanks for all the work that you put in before my time. So we were in the right place at the right time with some right ideas and business cases when Department of Communities and Justice released some of the different tranches. We were very fortunate because of that, but that did take many years, as both Karens will attest to as well, of developing what those ideas are, developing the people around us and having the right capability in order to respond to things. So not only were we able to work with Social Impact Hub on our strategic and business planning, we worked with CIFA on our theory of change and evaluation frameworks. We were working with InfoXchange on our strategy and gap analysis, as well as some outsourced IT support services. We're working with Aqua, who we fabulously happened to co-locate with, thanks to just a random conversation I had with Steve, the CEO there, one day. He said, I said, we're looking for a home, and he said, well, we've got some space. But we're working with Aqua on development of our workforce as well. So in addition to those things, though, we've been very fortunate, again, to be in the right place at the right time with the right business case to be granted money for towards our digital transformation. So digital transformation in our organisation, as with strategy in general, is live. So it's aiming as much as possible, as was mentioned earlier, to work on the business instead of in the business. And I don't think it matters what role you have in an organisation. That is really hard, and it sort of requires coming back to that every morning and throughout the day in order to try and keep that in check. So fortunately, we've worked well with our board of directors and ongoing work in progress, working with our team, because we're going through a lot of change, not only the pandemic, but also the change that I'm bringing to the organisation and our leadership and the like as well. So in terms of our digital transformation, that is one thing that we take seriously. So it's IT and digital transformation. We have a roadmap and we have maps of the infrastructure and how things work together. So our roadmap actually gets updated cyclically every sort of 6 weeks to 2 months based on where we're at with each of our projects and strategic initiatives in IT and digital transformation. Some of the funding that we received that was flexible and responsive from Department of Communities and Justice was towards a new website and towards our new CRM and towards some other digital capacity building initiatives. So in our time, and I think still generally speaking, in terms of, as was mentioned earlier, the pay what it takes in a technology or digital arena isn't that forthcoming necessarily. So certainly there's an opportunity to be prepared and to look for how you might work with organisations or be funded on digital transformation or to support it. But yes, we've managed to sort of piece our digital transformation roadmap together and to constantly review and evolve that. And the funding from the digital transformation from the Department of Communities and Justice funding has really helped with that. So for us, it's not one thing that's occurred. So I feel conscious of the fact that we were successful in working with under the Social Sector Support Fund with a number of organisations, but also in the digital transformation capacity building funding. However, that was a targeted approach, and we're very fortunate that we were able to do that. And I think then that the onus of responsibility that myself and the leadership and the board and our team have taken on is how can we create value for money for the department? How can we work collaboratively with these organisations to not only help ourselves and our beneficiaries, but to help other organisations and their beneficiaries? So fortunately, and hand on heart I'll say this, the work that we've done with, for example, CIFA and InfoXchange and Aqua and Social Impact Hub has helped us become successful in some recent tenders, relatively substantial tenders, which has allowed us the ability to reinvest into working with all of those organisations, apart from Aqua so far. But we do contribute in other ways, and I'm sure it's going to expand in a paid capacity. So yes, we're at a very intense learning phase that is evolving day to day. A really important piece of work that we're doing with Social Impact Hub and CIFA at the moment is to look for opportunities and gaps nationally and internationally. See how we can extrapolate that back into our organisation and what's happening in our environment, and see how we can aim to fill some of those gaps for our beneficiaries, but also the organisations that we work collectively with. So
Nadene, you mentioned that Playgroup has sort of a focus on disability, kids with disabilities, families with disability,
Yes.
and Matt, as you would know, that people with disability are far more vulnerable to sexual abuse than other areas. So Elle, if you could give any sort of advice on the strategic or operational things they could be doing with their technology systems to make them more suitable for dealing with people with disability, what would that be?
Look, first and foremost, co-design them with us. I think often people with disability, we are positioned as someone over there. We are the vulnerables over there. And that was a big framing of disabled people during COVID, whereas we are people with a considerable amount of expertise. So at the moment, I'm working with a group of people with intellectual disability, co-designing a project around employment, and I'm learning a great deal because their experiences of employment are very different to my own. So we have things in common. There are things that I can learn. So I think often we are positioned as someone else, and often other people speak for us. So, for example, the project around parents of children with disability, I'd also reach out to parents with disability. We know that 3 out of 5 parents with intellectual disability have their children removed, and that child removal is a huge issue for First Nations families with disability. So I think some of these things around the intersectional nature of disability, both within the disability community and within other demographic groups, are really important to understand, so that but there are also a whole lot of us who can sit at the table and actually contribute to projects. So I think that would be my very first and foremost, and also to include and bake in accessibility in all senses of what that means at the beginning of your projects, so that when you're doing your IT planning, you're including accessibility as a have to have, not a nice to have. Because if you need to actually retrofit accessibility into your systems, it's incredibly expensive. And so for many community sector organisations with limited budgets, that is what goes by the wayside. And you find, therefore, that people with disability can't access parts of your website, your CRM doesn't work, different kind of outreach technologies don't work, your chat doesn't work, because it hasn't been baked in from the beginning. So when you're talking to government and to other funders, talk about access as part of your tender negotiations and include enough funding to actually get it done. So they're my takeaways.
Yep, excellent. Thank you very much. And that, of course, is those key themes we've heard throughout the 2 days. Is listening is really, really important. And instead of just tweaking existing frameworks, maybe we need to redesign frameworks. I'd like to thank our panel very much for today.